A Journey to the Sea. Charlie told the rest of the household about Henry's arrival one by one. They began to visit the boy from the past. Peyton came first. He stood in the doorway for a second, blinking speechlessly, and then he strode up to Henry, exclaiming, "My dear, dear fellow, I can't believe it. This is just too wonderful for words." He shook Henry's hand vigorously. "I've heard so much about you. My father idolized you, you know." "Did he?" said Henry. "I suppose I'm your uncle?" When Peyton, while Peyton was still chuckling over this, Amy Bone looked in. "This is my mum," Charlie told Henry. "And you're Henry." Mrs. Bone gazed at Henry as if she couldn't quite believe her eyes. "All that way," she murmured. "All those years, I should say. So it really can happen." Was she thinking of her father? Charlie wondered. Was she wishing that he, too, might come twisting through time to be with her again? As Henry and Mrs. Bone solemnly shook hands, Henry said, "Mrs. Blord told me she knew," and then he seemed to change his mind. There was no time to ask Henry what Mrs. Blord knew, because at that moment Macy arrived on scene. "He looks a bit like Charlie, doesn't he?" she said. Just a little," said Amy. Wherever Henry had come from, it didn't matter to Macy. He was a boy in trouble and therefore in need of a hug. "You poor, poor mite," she cried, almost squeezing the life out of him. "You look half-starved. Come to the kitchen this minute and I'll cook you up a feast." "I don't think that'd be a good idea," said Charlie. "Grandma Bone might come down." "Drat Grandma Bone," said Macy. "What's she up to now? If she so much as lays a finger on this poor boy, I'll give her a good wallop." "Macy, dear, please lower your voice," said Peyton in a quiet but commanding tone. "If you want to help, you can bring a snack up to Charlie's room, and we shall need food and rugs for a long journey to the coast. I did mention it before." "Yes, Peyton," Macy said patiently. "I hadn't forgotten." "Come on, Mum. We've got work to do," said Amy. The two women went downstairs and prepared a hamper, while Henry chose some of Charlie's clothes to wear in his new life. "It'll be so strange," he said to Charlie. "I was always the oldest. I took care of James. What's he going to make of it all?" "I can't wait to find out," said Charlie. At 10 minutes to 12, Charlie and Henry climbed into Uncle Peyton's midnight blue car. They were followed by a pile of rugs and cushions and a huge hamper of food. "You help yourselves whenever you're peckish," said Macy, as she stuffed cushions behind their heads and tucked rugs around their legs. Peyton was already in the driver's seat, glancing impatiently at his watch. He was a man of habit, and he liked to leave for the coast at the stroke of midnight. As the great cathedral clock began to ring across the city, he said, "Snuggle down, boys. We'll have breakfast by the sea." The car doors were slammed, and Mrs. Bone and Macy waved and blew kisses from the curb as Peyton drove slowly up Filbert Street. In case of lamp accidents, he liked to keep to the side roads, and after driving down several badly lit alleys, they were suddenly deep in the countryside. Here there were no lights at all, except for the odd twinkle from a cowshed or a porch lantern. Charlie was beginning to drift off to sleep when a question popped in his head. "You told my mom Mrs. Blore knew something?" he said to Henry. "What did she know?" Henry yawned. "It was about your father," he mumbled sleepily. "Just before she disappeared, she said there was something she meant to tell you. I think she knew where your father was." Charlie sat bolt upright, throwing his cushion to the floor. "Didn't she tell you?" he demanded. "No," Henry murmured. "She just vanished." What did she say exactly? Charlie asked frantically. There was no answer. Henry had fallen asleep, and Charlie didn't have the heart to wake him. Did you hear that, Uncle Peyton? Said Charlie. Mrs. Blore knew where my father was. Or is. I heard, Charlie. Perhaps it means that he isn't very far away. We'll find him one day. That's a promise. Charlie thought he would never sleep after this amazing piece of news, but before he knew it, his eyes were closed. Whether he was awake or dreaming, Charlie could never be sure, but at some time during their long journey to the sea, his uncle began to talk about the Red King. Perhaps Charlie had mentioned the vanishing tree he had seen in the snow, or the strange red tree that had appeared in the king's portrait. But Peyton's words remained very clear in his head. I believe he is a tree, Charlie. That's what my books seem to tell me. When the king lived in the great forests with the only trees and his leopards for company, he became part of the forest himself. Can trees move, you might ask? Who can say? Who is to know if a tree standing in a field at dawn cannot later be seen in a castle ruin, or in the shadows of a great park? Perhaps one day you'll find out. When Charlie opened his eyes again, he saw a great sweep of a gray sea. They were traveling along a narrow cliff road, and light was beginning to fill the sky. He nudged Henry, who was still asleep beside him. Henry stirred and rubbed his eyes. Look, said Charlie, the sea. Henry looked out the window. I know this place, he cried. We're nearly home. There's a few miles yet to go, said Peyton. Let's have breakfast. There was a shout of agreement from the boys, and soon they were enjoying Macy's feast. A cold wind was howling outside, and so they ate in the car, watching huge, foamy breakers crashing onto the shore below. When breakfast was over, they set off again. The road ran beside the sea almost the whole way, and Charlie never tired of watching the waves, the tumbling cliffs, and the misty islands far out in the water. And then they turned a corner, and Henry cried, "We're here!" Ahead of them was a small bay where the sea was calm and blue. As they drove down toward the beach, sunlight spilled over the horizon, and the water became a sheet of sparkling glass. It was like entering another country. Gone were the dark clouds and the winter road. Gone were the wild waves pounding the shingle. What's happened? Said Charlie. Everything's gone calm. Like a spell, breathed Henry. They parked on a patch of grass beside the beach. On the other side of the road, Charlie could see a white house perched on top of a steep cliff. Is that it? He asked Henry. Henry just nodded. They crossed the road and climbed 2 flights of whitewashed steps set into the cliff. Uncle Peyton went first, while Charlie following, but Henry hung back. He seemed to be afraid of what he might find in the house at the top of the steps. There was a porch with a blue-painted door at the side of the house. Peyton let himself in, and Charlie stepped in after him. They went through another door and into a room that seemed to be full of sunlight. An old man came toward them. His hair was white and his eyes were gray, although he was obviously very old. His face looked young somehow, as though all his wrinkles had come from smiling in sea weather. I saw you arrive, the old man said, giving Peyton a big hug. So, this is Charlie. Well. At last we meet. At last, said Charlie. while his great-grandfather clutched him to his chest. Henry was standing just inside the door. He was staring at the old man, and then the old man saw him, and they just gazed at each other without saying a word. At last Henry said, "Jamie?" As if someone under all those wrinkles he'd suddenly seen his little brother, the boy he'd left behind when he went to play his last game of marbles. James Eubeam still couldn't speak. His eyes had a glittery, tearful look, and Peyton took Charlie aside while the two brothers hugged each other. It was almost too much for the old man. He sank into an armchair and shook his head over and over again. "I can't believe it," he said. "It's really you." He reached into his pocket and brought out a small leather bag. "Look, Henry, I've still got the marbles." Henry sat on the arm of his chair. "I'll teach you how to play ring-taw," he said. "About time, too," said James with a laugh. And then another extraordinary thing happened. A door opened and Cook walked into the room. Or was it Cook? "Cook?" said Charlie. "Not Cook," said the woman. "I'm Cook's sister, Pearl." "So that's why the sea was so calm," Henry murmured. Pearl nodded and gave him a big smile. It turned out that Pearl had been James Eubeam's housekeeper for 20 years, ever since his wife died. They all began to talk about Henry's future, how he would go to the local school beyond the bay. "It's small and friendly," said Pearl. "Henry will fit in perfectly. He can start in the summer term when Charlie's filled in on the bits of all the newfangled things like mobile phones and videos and whatnot." It was decided that Charlie would come to see Henry once a month every time Peyton visited his father. "And in the holidays, too," said Henry. "Charlie must come here in the holidays." "Of course," said Peyton. Charlie had never had a holiday by the sea. It was something he'd always dreamt about, but he'd never really believed it would happen. He looked through the window at the sparkling water and the sandy beach. He didn't have to wait long to visit the beach. Old James Eubeam had been awake all night, and now, after all the excitement, he fell fast asleep in his chair. Peyton went upstairs for a snooze before his long drive back to the city, and Pearl began to prepare a meal. "You two should go down to the shore," she told the boys. "You both look as if you could do with some fresh air." They didn't need any more encouragement. Charlie and Henry spent the rest of the day on the beach. They skimmed pebbles across the water, jumped over rock pools, explored the caves that Henry knew so well. All too soon, night clouds began to roll in across the water, and Uncle Peyton was calling the boys to supper. They sat around a table in the bay window where they could watch the moonlit water. There were candles on the table, but the rest of the room was in darkness. Old Mr. Eubeam always removed the light bulbs on Peyton's visits. As Charlie tucked into the delicious supper that Pearl had prepared, he couldn't help but of thinking of Cook, in her little underground rooms, far away from the sea and the sun. "I wish Cook could find a place like this to live," he said. Pearl told him that Cook was very happy where she was. She loved keeping an eye on the children at Bloor's Academy. "We talk on the phone for hours," said Pearl. "And Treasure." That's her name. "Treasure tells me everything that's been going on with you children of the Red King, and sometimes I think it's me who's missing out." "But now you've got Henry," said Charlie. "Now I've got Henry." Pearl's eyes twinkled. "And I can see that he's going to be quite a handful." They all laughed at this, and then Uncle Peyton stood up, saying, "Come on, Charlie. We've got to get you home, or you'll never be awake in time for school tomorrow." "School? Ah," sighed Charlie. He wished he could stay longer. Two brothers, one so old and the other still young, stood at the top of the cliff steps. and waved goodbye as Peyton and Charlie climbed into the midnight blue car. Charlie snuggled down in the seat beside his uncle, and the car roared to life. "I think Henry's going to be okay. Don't you?" he said. "Okay," said Peyton. "He's going to be absolutely splendid." "Well done, Charlie."